At my sister's engagement party, Brooke lifted her champagne glass, looked straight at me, and smiled like she had been waiting all night to deliver the line. "Some people find love," she said. "Some people just end up paying for everybody else's." The table erupted. Dean laughed hardest. My mother covered her mouth as though Brooke had said something brilliant. Even a few relatives who barely knew me joined in because humiliation is apparently funnier when the victim is standing close enough to hear it. I smiled too. Not because it was funny, because if I had opened my mouth in that moment, I knew exactly what would have come out. Instead, I walked toward the gift table, picked up the gold envelope I had placed there earlier, slid it beneath my arm, and opened my phone. Inside that envelope were confirmations for a 10-day honeymoon in Hawaii that had cost me nearly $9,000. Flights, oceanfront hotel, excursions, private snorkeling, dinner reservations, everything. Brooke had no idea. 5 minutes after her little joke, neither of them had a honeymoon anymore. My name is Taylor Bennett, and I had spent 3 months putting that gift together. I picked up extra shifts at school, coached weekend clinics, and even started tutoring 2 students in the evenings because I wanted to give Brooke something unforgettable. We had never been close in the easy, affectionate way sisters sometimes are, but some foolish part of me still believed generosity could repair what years of resentment had damaged. When I messaged the travel agent asking whether the entire booking could be canceled, my hands shook slightly. I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt strangely calm. The humiliation was still there, burning beneath my skin, but something else had replaced the instinct to defend myself. I simply stopped participating. The agent confirmed that most of the trip could be refunded. I put my phone away. Brooke discovered it while she was still circulating between tables. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. Her expression emptied. Then her eyes found mine across the room. "Taylor!" she shouted. Dean turned toward her, confused, while nearby conversations died almost instantly. I didn't answer. I walked through the restaurant doors and into the parking lot. Cold evening air hit my face like water. Halfway to my car, I heard Brooke's heels behind me. Seriously? It was a joke. Dean followed, telling me I needed to stop being so sensitive. Neither of them asked what had been inside the envelope. They only knew something had changed. I got into my car and drove away while Brooke stood under the parking lot lights with her arms crossed, furious that I had ruined the ending she expected. My phone vibrated until after midnight. Brooke called, Dean called, Mom called repeatedly. Cousins I rarely heard from suddenly had opinions about my behavior. My father did not contact me at all that night. Strangely, his silence comforted me more than everyone else's noise. Dad had been sitting close enough during the toast for me to notice that he never laughed. He knew our family too well. Brooke could insult me publicly. Mom could excuse it privately. And eventually, everybody would wait for me to restore peace by pretending nothing happened. That was what family usually meant in our house. The next morning, I had 36 unread messages. Before noon, my front door opened. Mom still had an emergency key, a decision I immediately began regretting. She walked inside and started lecturing before she had even removed her coat. I had embarrassed Brooke. Guests were asking questions. I had behaved immaturely. She paced across my living room while I sat silently, waiting for one sentence that never came. "What did Brooke say to you?" Instead, she finally muttered, "And if the gift was really that expensive, you could have warned her." I looked at her. That was when I realized Brooke had finally told her what she had lost. $9,000, I said. I paid for their honeymoon. Mom stopped moving. Flights, hotel, activities, dinners. 10 days in Hawaii. I canceled it after her toast. For perhaps 2 seconds, reality reached her. Then the familiar machinery started again. That isn't the point, Taylor. It was always fascinating how quickly the point changed whenever Brooke was losing an argument. I told Mom I wasn't attending the wedding. She warned me that I would regret tearing the family apart. I asked whether Brooke regretted humiliating me in front of everyone. Mom avoided the question. Later that evening, Dad finally called. He didn't give me a speech. He just said, "I understand." 2 words spoken quietly. Somehow they mattered more than every accusation I had heard all day. Brooke left a tearful voicemail afterward, claiming she never knew how much I had spent and that she had only been trying to make everyone laugh. She said my name in the soft voice she had used since childhood whenever she wanted forgiveness without admitting responsibility. I deleted the voicemail. 2 days later, Mom texted that Dad supposedly thought I was being dramatic and wanted me to stop punishing Brooke. The problem was that Dad had spoken to me that same morning and said almost the opposite. I called him. "Did you tell Mom I'm being dramatic?" There was a pause. No. That single lie clarified more than years of arguments ever had. Mom wasn't trying to resolve anything. She was trying to restore the old balance. Brooke created the problem. I absorbed it. Dad avoided conflict, and Mom rewrote reality until everyone returned to their assigned positions. Only this time I refused. Brooke and Dean appeared outside my workplace the following afternoon. Dean tried reason first, explaining that they had been excited about Hawaii and that the trip meant more to them than I understood. Brooke stood beside him looking wounded, as though I had stolen something belonging to her. "It isn't about Hawaii," I said. "Then what is it about?" Dean asked. "Respect." They stared at me. That expression told me everything. The concept itself seemed unreasonable to them. A few nights later, another uncomfortable fact returned to me. Brooke's silver Toyota Highlander was technically mine. She had needed transportation during a job transition and couldn't qualify for financing, so I had signed for it. 16 months later, I was still attached to the loan and insurance, while Brooke and Dean drove it every day. If they crashed it, skipped payments, or created a legal problem, my name was connected to the consequences. Suddenly, that arrangement felt insane. I contacted the lender, documented that I no longer authorized their use of the vehicle, and spoke with the insurer about removing my financial exposure. The explosion arrived that evening. Brooke called screaming after a traffic stop resulted in the Highlander being held because of unresolved ownership and registration issues. She demanded that I fix everything immediately. I told her I had spent years fixing everything for her, and I was finished. Mom called the next morning and accused me of sabotaging my sister's future. I asked whether she wanted to assume the loan herself. She became noticeably quieter. Dad was the only person who asked whether I was certain. When I said yes, he sighed. "Then protect yourself." I thought that would be the end of it. 3 evenings later, Brooke appeared at my door alone. She wasn't wearing the polished makeup or expensive clothes she usually treated like armor. She had on a faded hoodie. Her hair was pulled back carelessly. Dark circles sat beneath her eyes. For the first time in years, she looked less like my confident younger sister and more like someone genuinely frightened. "We're in trouble," she said. Dean had invested in a real estate flip with someone he barely knew. The property had been shut down over code violations. The contractor disappeared. Their partner stopped returning calls. A private lender wanted his money. "How bad?" I asked. "About $60,000. Then Brooke asked me for 55. She called it a temporary loan. 6 months at most. A new investor was supposedly coming in. They simply needed enough money to survive until the deal could be repaired. Every instinct I had told me to close the door. I remembered the engagement party, the car, the childhood lies, the borrowed money she never returned. I remembered an old boyfriend once telling me that my greatest weakness was confusing rescue with love. But Brooke was my sister, and some part of me was still waiting for her to become the person I kept pretending she could be. So I let her inside. Looking back, canceling that honeymoon wasn't the decision that changed my life. Opening that door was, because within weeks, Brooke would disappear with $55,000 of my money, and I would learn that the engagement party joke had never been the real betrayal. It had only been the warning. The next morning, I told myself I was helping Brooke one final time, and I repeated that sentence so often it started to sound less like a decision and more like a prayer. I went to the bank, signed paperwork against the equity in my condo, and watched years of careful saving turn into numbers on a screen. $55,000. My emergency fund had always been the thing that made me feel safe after my last relationship ended and taught me how quickly stability could disappear when you depended on another person. Now I was handing most of that security to someone who had spent years proving she considered my generosity permanent. I should have demanded a contract. I should have called a lawyer. I should have asked to see Dean's paperwork, the lender documents, anything. Instead, I transferred the money because Brooke sat across from me looking terrified, and because I still wanted to believe fear had finally made her honest. Her response came almost instantly. "You saved us," she texted, followed by hearts and crying emojis. Then she sent a voice message telling me she loved me and promising I would have every dollar back within 6 months. Her voice sounded lighter than it had in my apartment, almost cheerful. At the time, I took that as relief. Later, I would realize it was because the difficult part of their plan was already over. They had the money. Week 1 passed, without much communication. I sent Brooke a message asking how things were progressing. No answer. I told myself she and Dean were meeting lawyers, negotiating with lenders, fixing the mess. By the second week, my calls went straight to voicemail. Dean didn't answer either. I began waking in the middle of the night with the same question pounding through my head. What exactly did I just finance? During the 3rd week, I called Mom. She sounded irritated that I was worried. Brooke and Dean had apparently decided to get away for a little while. Mom said they needed space after everything that had happened. I asked where they had gone. She didn't know. That answer made my stomach drop. I drove to Brooke's house that evening. The driveway was empty. Curtains closed. Packages sat by the door. Mail protruded from the box in thick, neglected layers. I knocked, even though I already knew no one would answer. Standing there, I suddenly remembered Brooke hugging me after asking for the money. It had felt awkward then, almost mechanical. Now it felt like goodbye. I sat in my car for 15 minutes staring at her empty house before I finally admitted what I had been avoiding. My sister had taken the money and vanished. I filed a police report during the 4th week. Saying the words aloud made everything feel worse. $55,000, transfer made voluntarily. Sister now missing. Possible fraud. The officer listened carefully and asked questions I wished I had asked before sending the money. Did I have a written agreement? No. Proof of the real estate debt? No. Messages describing why she needed the funds? Yes. He told me they would investigate the accounts and contact Dean's business connections. His expression stayed professional, but I could see the skepticism behind it. I walked out feeling like the stupidest woman alive. That night, Mom left me a voicemail, demanding to know how I could report my own sister to the police. She didn't ask whether I was financially okay. She didn't ask whether I might lose my home. She asked what the investigation would do to Brooke. Dad responded differently. He came over with takeout, sat across from me at the kitchen table, and listened while I finally admitted how afraid I was. The new loan payment was larger than I expected. My savings were almost gone. I had no idea whether I would recover anything. Dad didn't try to defend Brooke. He didn't tell me family problems should remain private. He just said, "You believed her because she's your sister. That doesn't make what she did less deliberate." It was one of the few times in my life he named the problem without softening it for Mom. I appreciated him for it, but appreciation didn't pay the bills. I canceled the gym membership, stopped ordering food, sold a watch I rarely wore, and started tutoring more evenings after work. I learned how quickly a comfortable life could shrink when every spare dollar belonged to a debt created by somebody else. 3 months went by. Every morning, I checked the police portal before getting out of bed. The case always showed the same thing. Open investigation. I started ignoring unknown phone numbers because every unfamiliar call sent adrenaline through me. Half of me wanted Brooke to contact me. Half of me dreaded hearing her voice. Mom had stopped yelling and moved into a quieter strategy, periodically sending messages saying Brooke was probably scared and would eventually explain herself. I never answered. Dad checked on me every few days. The rest of the family mostly avoided the subject, which somehow felt worse than gossip. Silence allowed everybody to pretend nothing catastrophic had happened while I ate canned soup at my kitchen counter, calculating whether I could afford my property taxes. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, my phone rang while I was setting equipment out for soccer practice. The detective introduced himself and immediately said, "We found them." I sat down on the nearest bench. Brooke and Dean had been located outside Flagstaff, Arizona. They were living in a rental cabin and keeping most of their transactions away from their real names. Dean had been working cash jobs detailing recreational vehicles. Brooke had been taking online design work through an account connected to someone else. Investigators had traced money through third-party transfers and eventually connected enough of the activity back to them. Both had been arrested that morning. I expected relief. What I felt instead was exhaustion so deep I could barely speak. The detective kept explaining details, but I was staring at the grass thinking about every dinner I had skipped while my sister hid in Arizona using money borrowed against my home. A few days later, I received a call from a correctional facility. I almost declined it. Then I answered. Brooke said my name and immediately started crying. She told me Dean had convinced her they needed to disappear temporarily, that everything had gotten out of control, that they had always planned to repay me. She said Dean was blaming her now. She said prosecutors were using words like conspiracy and fraud. Then her voice softened. "Taylor, please. I'm your sister." I closed my eyes. That sentence used to have power over me. She begged me to tell the authorities it had been a misunderstanding. She said prison would destroy her life. She promised she would spend the rest of her life making things right. I listened until she finally stopped talking and waited for me to rescue her again. Then I disconnected the call. That afternoon I met with the district attorney's office. The evidence was stronger than I expected. Investigators had recovered messages discussing the transfer before Brooke ever came to my apartment. There were financial records, false account information, transfers between third parties, and proof they had prepared to leave before asking me for help. That detail broke something inside me more completely than the missing money ever had. Brooke hadn't panicked afterward. She hadn't been dragged into a desperate decision by Dean at the last second. She had stood inside my living room wearing that faded hoodie, looked exhausted and frightened, and performed exactly what she thought I needed to see. The prosecutor asked whether I was willing to cooperate, testify if necessary, and pursue restitution. I said yes to all three. Mom found out that evening and called me sobbing. She said Brooke had made a terrible mistake but didn't deserve prison. She insisted Dean had manipulated her. She said I could still stop everything if I told prosecutors I didn't want charges pursued. I asked one question. If I had taken $55,000 from Brooke and disappeared for 3 months, would you be asking her to protect me? Mom went silent. That silence answered more clearly than anything she could have said. Dad called later. I told him I was moving forward. He was quiet for several seconds before saying, "Then finish it." For the first time, I understood that this was no longer about the engagement party, the honeymoon, the car, or even the money. Those had only been chapters in the same pattern. Brooke kept taking, because somebody always softened the consequences. Mom kept protecting her because admitting what Brooke was capable of would mean admitting how long she had enabled it. I kept rescuing her because I had confused being needed with being loved. The upcoming trial would decide what happened to Brooke and Dean legally, but something more important had already been decided inside me. Whatever happened next, I would never again be the emergency fund, the backup plan, or the sister expected to bleed quietly so everyone else could call the family healthy. The case never became the dramatic courtroom war my mother seemed to imagine. There were no screaming confessions, no surprise witnesses bursting through the doors, no last-second miracle that made everything disappear. By late fall, Brooke and Dean both accepted plea agreements because the evidence against them was overwhelming. Investigators had reconstructed the timeline almost day by day. The messages about approaching me for money, the transfer, their preparations to leave, the accounts opened through other people, the cash jobs, the cabin in Arizona. What Brooke had spent months calling panic looked very different when it was printed on paper and placed in chronological order. It looked organized. It looked intentional. Most importantly, it looked criminal. Their attorneys negotiated what they could, but eventually both of them stood before a judge and pleaded guilty. I sat behind the prosecution table during sentencing, hands folded tightly in my lap. Brooke was only 20 feet away from me, yet she never looked in my direction. She stared at the floor while the prosecutor explained what they had done and how their actions had affected me financially. Dean behaved differently. He kept shifting in his chair, whispering to his attorney, sometimes wearing that faint expression of disbelief people have when consequences finally become real. I wondered whether he still believed he was smarter than everybody in that room. Maybe part of him expected another deal, another person to rescue him, another technicality that would send him home. None came. The judge sentenced both of them to 18 months in state prison. When the words were spoken, Mom made a sound behind me like someone had struck her. I didn't turn around. The court also ordered restitution. Investigators had managed to freeze several accounts before Brooke and Dean could spend everything, so roughly 90% of the $55,000 eventually came back to me. When my attorney told me the amount, everyone expected me to be relieved. I was relieved, financially. Of course I was. That money meant I might not have to sell my condo. It meant I could breathe without calculating every grocery purchase against my loan payment. But there was something strange about receiving the check. It arrived in an ordinary envelope with official paperwork attached, as if 3 months of fear could be converted into a neat number and returned through the mail. The missing 10% was gone. So were the interest payments, the things I sold, the evenings I spent tutoring because I was terrified of falling behind, and the trust I would never recover. After the hearing, Mom followed me into the courthouse hallway. Her face was swollen from crying. 18 months, she said, like I had personally chosen the number. Do you understand what this is going to do to Brooke? I stared at her for a moment, because even then, after everything, her first instinct was still to measure the damage done to my sister. She told me Brooke would lose friends, career opportunities, possibly her marriage. She said I could have found another way. Family counseling, private repayment, anything except police and prosecutors. I asked her the same question I had asked before, but this time I made her hear every word. If I had borrowed $55,000 from Brooke, lied about why I needed it, disappeared with it, and lived under another identity for 3 months, would you be standing here asking Brooke why she didn't forgive me? Mom opened her mouth. Nothing came out. That silence finally freed me from something. All my life, I had believed there must be some perfect explanation I could give that would make Mom see the imbalance. If I was calm enough, patient enough, generous enough, eventually she would understand. Standing in that courthouse hallway, I realized understanding had never been the problem. She understood perfectly. She simply preferred a family structure where Brooke was protected and I was dependable. Brooke could make mistakes because I would repair them. Mom could deny the unfairness because acknowledging it would require admitting her role in creating it. I wasn't going to win an argument against a system that depended on me losing. So I stopped trying. Dad hadn't attended sentencing. Crowded courtrooms and family confrontations had never been his strength. I called him afterward while sitting in my car. 18 months, I said. There was a pause, then he answered, "Good. Maybe now everyone can stop pretending nothing happened." It was colder than anything I expected from him, but I understood what he meant. Dad had watched the pattern longer than I had. His failure was that he had spent years recognizing it without confronting it. In the months after Brooke's arrest, though, something in him changed. Maybe seeing where our family dynamic finally led forced him to admit that silence was its own form of participation. He apologized once for not stepping in more when we were younger. I didn't tell him everything was fine. It wasn't. But I appreciated that he finally said it. Brooke and Dean's reputation collapsed quickly once the details became public within the family. People who had defended them after the engagement party suddenly became very quiet. Friends stopped asking about them. Relatives who once described Brooke as spontaneous and ambitious began remembering all the warning signs they had ignored. Stories surfaced about unpaid loans, exaggerated business opportunities, favors that were never returned. It was strange watching everybody rewrite their memories after the truth became undeniable. I didn't enjoy it. I also didn't correct them. For years, I had been treated as the difficult sister whenever I questioned Brooke. Now the same people who had told me to relax were calling to say they had always suspected something was wrong. What surprised me most was how differently some relatives began treating me. At Thanksgiving that year, nobody directly mentioned Brooke. Her absence sat at the table anyway, invisible and enormous. Mom had left one chair unused. Something I suspected was deliberate. Dad ignored it. An uncle asked me to carve the turkey, even though he had never asked before. Two cousins later pulled me aside to ask for advice about lending money to family members. An aunt who had once told me I was too serious said quietly that she respected how I handled everything. I didn't suddenly feel powerful. Mostly, I felt tired. It was strange that establishing boundaries after being robbed made people respect me more than years of generosity ever had. The letters started about 2 months after Brooke was sentenced. She sent them to Mom, who passed them along to me whether I wanted them or not. The first one was only a page. Brooke wrote about prison food, how slowly the days passed, how she missed sleeping in her own bed. She said she thought about me constantly. There was an apology buried near the end, but even then it was wrapped in explanations about pressure, fear, and Dean's influence. The second letter was similar. The third talked about how she hoped we could rebuild when she got out. I read each one once and placed them in a drawer. She kept describing what had happened to her after she stole from me. She rarely described what she had done to me before she was caught. That difference mattered. Mom treated those letters like evidence that Brooke was changing. Every few weeks she would mention some sentence Brooke had written, trying to create a bridge I had never asked for. "She really misses you," Mom would say. Or, "She knows she made mistakes." Eventually I told her I didn't want any more letters delivered unless Brooke wrote something I actually needed for legal or financial reasons. Mom looked hurt. I let her look hurt. That was another change in me. I had spent most of my life believing other people's disappointment meant I had done something wrong. Now, I understood that sometimes disappointment was simply the reaction people had when they discovered your boundaries were real. Financially, I rebuilt slowly. The restitution allowed me to reduce the home equity debt dramatically. I stopped tutoring every evening but kept a few students because I discovered I actually enjoyed it. I bought groceries without calculating the total before reaching the register. Months later, I replaced the watch I had sold not with something expensive, just something I chose for myself. Tiny things became symbols of normal life returning. Yet I was different. When someone asked to borrow money, I asked questions. When someone tried to make me feel guilty for saying no, I noticed immediately. I stopped treating access to me as something people automatically deserved because we shared DNA. For a long time, I thought the engagement party was the moment everything broke. Brooke's champagne glass raised in the air, everyone laughing. Me quietly taking back the honeymoon envelope. But eventually, I realized nothing broke that night. The family had been broken for years. That night was simply the first time I refused to pretend otherwise. The canceled trip, the Highlander, the $55,000, Arizona, the arrest, the courtroom. Each event stripped away another excuse until there was nothing left except the truth. Brooke didn't destroy our relationship alone. Mom's protection helped. Dad's silence helped. And my endless willingness to rescue Brooke helped too. I couldn't change what they had done, but I could change the role I played afterward. People talk about forgiveness as if it always means reopening the door. I don't believe that anymore. Maybe someday I'll forgive Brooke completely. Maybe I already have in the sense that I no longer wake up angry. But forgiveness doesn't require another loan, another key, another opportunity to prove she has changed at my expense. Some bridges should be rebuilt. Others exist only to lead you back somewhere you nearly didn't survive. Brooke and Dean chose deception, and they lived with the consequences. Mom chose denial, and she had to live with the distance it created. I chose something different. I chose myself. I watched that old bridge collapse behind me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't turn around to see whether anyone needed me to rebuild it.